Socioeconomic drivers of biodiversity loss in Colombia.
Weather is getting bad, but people are even worse. Throughout investigating biodiversity loss in Colombia, we found that there is a lack of scientific research regarding specific biogeographic and climatic threats towards biodiversity within this region. However, we've observed that certain human-driven social, economic, and political circumstances are significantly impacting the biodiversity rates of plant species, forests, and territorial fragmentation in Colombia. Furthermore, we've assessed how these factors are being mitigated within the region by local indigenous communities, politically charged militia groups, and internationally funded conservation projects. From our research, we've observed that the following occurrences are some of the primary emerging threats to local ecosystems and biodiversity in Colombia. First, resource extraction due to industry growth. Corporate territorial expansion is increasing as agricultural and mining resources are being continuously cultivated and exploited. Second, the commodification of traditional indigenous medicine. The growing popularity of psychoactive plants in Western culture has fetishized certain indigenous plant species in Colombia and consequently increased their export. And last, political conflict and military expansion. Conflicting political groups within Colombia across the last 50 years have contributed to human displacement and territorial zoning for military purposes, both impacting natural ecosystems and local communities.
Mining activity in Colombia is both legal and illegal, leading to the destruction of over 400,000 hectares from the year 2001 to 2018. Illegal mining operations in Colombia have led to the destruction of over 180,000 hectares of forest, while an estimated 278,000 hectares have been destroyed due to illegal mining operations. Colombia's gold mining industry saw a 511% increase in activity between the years of 2016 and 2018. The coal industry also saw growth, increasing by 257% during the same time period. Not all companies in Colombia are contributing to deforestation. In fact, only 1 to 3% of all mining operations in Colombia contribute to roughly 60% of all deforestation efforts. This provides evidence for the fact that a very small proportion of Colombian firms are concentrating a substantial proportion of efforts towards deforestation, many of which are illegal operations. At the same time, increasing demands on livestock and basic crops such as corn have led to agricultural deforestation in Colombia. Between the years of 1954 and 2009, 14.7% of the land in Colombia experienced deforestation and loss of land cover. Grazing fields that are used to support livestock account for 68% of the cleared land in Colombia. The study also found that an 86% decrease in forest area occurred while crop prices increased by 407%. This infers that socioeconomic factors, such as livestock farming, agriculture, and market prices, have been an important driver in the modification of the landscape and the destruction of biodiversity in Colombia.
Commodifying indigenous medicine. For over 3,000 years, Andean indigenous communities have used plants like E. pachinoi, the same page or cactus, which contains mescaline, and B. capi, which is the ayahuasca vine, in spiritual and medical contexts. The psychoactive nature of these species was introduced to the West in the late 19th century as Western botanical sciences were developing and Europeans were discovering and exporting tropical plants back to the Old World. In recent decades, the use of these plants outside of Colombia has grown considerably. The ceremonial consumption of said psychoactives carries heavy cultural significance. Traditionally, they're not used as recreational drugs, but as treatments for an array of medico-spiritual ailments or as a means to establish contact with one's ancestors. As the awareness and demand for substances like ayahuasca and mescaline swells internationally, their parent plants become commodities and are now exported as such. So alongside this growth and demand for the raw product has also come an appetite for authentic psychedelic encounters in the form of retreats to indigenous communities, usually in Colombia or Peru, where tourists can be guided through their experiences by certified shamans. The trend has led to an established drug tourism industry in Latin America and not only forced the commodification of organic psychoactives, but also that of the very cultures from which they originate. Cultural ethical implications aside, the other problem with this developing Western taste for tropical psychoactives is its environmental consequences. The uptick in consumption has put considerable strain on E. pachinoi and B. capi populations, disturbing their native ecosystems.
For 5 decades, Colombia has suffered one of the most intense internal displacement situations related with conflict and violence. The government of Colombia's main armed organization, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, reached a peace agreement in 2016, which was a significant development and a precondition for securing long-term solutions for the country's IDPs. However, 5 years into the implementation, violence caused by a variety of factors, including armed conflict, illegal armed groups, and expansion of large-scale agriculture and mining operations continued in conflicted areas, leading to greater displacement. The country is also highly vulnerable to a variety of natural disasters, including floods and landslides, which cause thousands of people to flee each year. The effects of rural displacement on communities in Colombian tropics have been devastating. Many people have been displaced, have lost their homes, lands, and livelihoods, and have been forced to flee to urban areas or other regions in search of safety and stability. This has led to overcrowding and poverty in many cities and towns, as well as a loss of cultural identity and traditional ways of life for many displaced communities. To address the issues of rural displacement in the Colombian tropics, the government and international organizations have implemented various programs and initiatives.
We've identified that some political organizations are directly working towards decreasing deforestation, while certain international conservation projects focus on allocating monetary resources towards environmental research and preservation projects in Colombia. Besides these two actors, our research suggests an increasing awareness that traditional indigenous practices surrounding plant conservation and land treatment are significantly effective in preventing biodiversity loss.
Conservation efforts by political groups, gunpoint conservation by militia groups have been used by the FARC in the past, which caused forced prohibition of cutting down trees or hunting, and has preserved the coverage of forests that have been used by them to hide from the army, typically composed of local volunteers who are trained and armed to protect natural areas and wildlife from illegal activities such as poaching and deforestation. The pros are preventing deforestation effectively, rapid conversion of forests and crops to cattle ranches and coca plantations, enticed immediate responses from government and policymakers. However, it's often grassroots based. Certain cons of it are instances of abuse and violence by conservation armed militia, which have raised concerns about their use and raised questions about the best way to protect natural areas in Colombia. And also historically, there have been controversial cases where they've actually taxed and condoned illegal cocaine and drug trade, and put a toll on trade routes regarding drug trade.
Conservation efforts have ramped up in recent years in response to E. pachinoi and B. capi population decline, largely because of the economic incentives of drug tourism. Local economies are reliant to a degree on tourism as visitors spend money on goods during their travels, and there is, of course, no drug tourism industry with no ayahuasca. Local farmers have begun cultivating B. capi independently and harvesting more sustainably in response to increased demand and diminished supply. The COVID-19 pandemic also offered a temporary respite from overharvesting as international travel to Colombian and Peruvian resorts ceased. The downside is that it potentially compromises the integrity of traditional usage. Some indigenous people see the inclusion of outsiders in sacred medicinal practice as antithetical to its original purpose. Many tourists do not understand the cultural implications of their participation and are attracted to Latin American drug retreats because of indigenous communities' perceived exoticism and disconnection from civilization. American anthropologist Marlene Dobkin de Rios, for instance, argued that, quote, ayahuasca use is linked in a matrix dealing with moral order, with good and evil, with animals and humans, and with health and illness, which has little correspondence or sympathy with the experiences of people in industrial societies. Again, however, this is not a universally agreed upon take. Some indigenous groups see the wider distribution of their cultural practices in a more positive light. Finally, the increased demands for ceremonies means more unqualified individuals posing as certified shamans, which both cheapens the significance of true shamanism and puts participants in physical danger. These hallucinogenic plants should not be administered by untrained individuals, but there's a monetary incentive for some people to do so.
The Biofin Project is a United Nations Development Program managed global conservation project that focuses on the need for financial support towards scientific research, indigenous practices, and other environmental efforts concerning biodiversity. Biofin engages with the governments, local communities, and the private sector of almost 40 ecologically vulnerable countries, including Colombia. The pros of the Biofin project is that it emphasizes the role of local economy and financial support for conservation. That being said, it should be questioned how this project performs under a neo-colonial paradigm when expanding globally, as Biofin was originally initiated under the European Commission. Furthermore, the priority they place on capital growth in preventing biodiversity loss may overshadow sincere motives within the project and push aside locals' interests. Overall, we've determined that there are several socioeconomic drivers that directly contribute to biodiversity loss in Colombia alongside global climate change. Industry growth is causing an increase of territorial zoning for agriculture and resource extraction for international export, which is resulting in evolving landscapes, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. However, the growing popularity of indigenous practices from this region may allow for local economy growth and re-ownership of indigenous land treatment, thus effectively maintaining certain plant species. Political unrest likewise disturbs certain aspects of the environment, despite the fact that some militia groups work towards actively preventing deforestation. Regardless of these factors, there is an obvious need for more research about ecosystems and species diversity in Colombia in order to better identify and mitigate specific processes within the natural environment that cause biodiversity loss.
Thanks for listening.